Please listen carefully for the word of God. My son. Let me take this off. Better. My son, if you accept my words and store up my commands within you, turning your ear to wisdom and applying your heart to understanding. Indeed, if you call out for insight and cry aloud for understanding, and if you look for it as for silver and search for it as for hidden treasure, then you will understand the fear of the Lord and find the knowledge of God. And then, from the New Testament, 1 Corinthians, where is the wise person? Where is the teacher of the law? Where is the philosopher of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? For since in the wisdom of God, the world through its wisdom did not know him, God was pleased through the foolishness of what was preached to save those who believe. Jews demand signs and Greeks look for wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to the Jews and foolishness to the Gentiles. But to those whom God has called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God. For the foolishness of God is wiser than human wisdom, and the weakness of God is stronger than human strength. And then finally, from the book of James, but the wisdom that comes from heaven is first of all pure, then peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy and good fruit, impartial and sincere. Peacemakers who sow in peace reap a harvest of righteousness. Now, I know that what I'm about to say is going to totally shock you. In fact, I'm sure that you probably won't be able to believe me. But when I was in middle school and high school, as I was first becoming a Christian, I was the biggest, skinniest, dorkiest, nerdiest geek you would have ever met in your whole life. I know, you can't even imagine it, can you? Right? Right? And don't tell me that the only part you can't imagine is the skinny part, because I will be really upset. But it was my entire persona. It was the way I understood my identity. I was the nerdy smart kid. I was the president of the math club, and in the science club, I had this very sort of intellectual, scientific outlook on things. I loved reading Stephen Hawking and J.R.R. Tolkien, even in 7th grade. And so when I first started coming to the church and to the youth group, I found myself in a bit of a predicament. Because on the one hand, everything that I was hearing sounded so right and so true. Every story we read from this book, everything that our teachers were telling us, it just sounded right. The way that Rob Bell says that the Christian faith, that the gospel of Jesus Christ is reality at its rawest. That is what it felt like to me. I felt like every time I turned a page, I was saying, yes, oh my gosh, yes, this is who I am. This is who we are. This is what the world is like. And this is who I could be. This is who I want to be. I want this. And then there were other things that to my scientific and rational mind seemed like cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs. Are you kidding me? Parting of the Red Sea, walking on water, changing, what was that? Water into wine? The virgin birth, the resurrection from the dead. Who do you think you are talking to? And yet, I was meeting people who I respected and admired incredibly. People who were smart and intelligent and intellectual and successful and engaged in the world. But more than that, people who were good. People who were kind and thoughtful and generous and gracious. People who wanted to make a difference and help and serve others. A few of them invited me to join them in their men's, and I use that word lightly, men's small group, where we were studying this book, C.S. Lewis's Screwtape Letters. And this is actually the copy that I was using back in 9th grade. I still have it. And every time we got together to eat Oreos and drink Mountain Dew and read another letter in the Screwtape Letters, for those of you who haven't heard of it before, it's a fictional tale about a senior devil who's got an apprentice, a junior devil, and he's teaching him about the fine arts of temptation. And they're always talking about the patient here on the earth that they're trying to tempt. And every letter, it was just so spot on. It was so smart and so thoughtful about who we are and what we're like, and in this sort of reverse psychology, what we need to not be doing in this world. And it kind of exposed the lies that our world is constantly telling us and trying to get us to believe by warning us of the things that we need to be honest about with ourselves so that we can become more, so that we can grow. And I was amazed to find out that this guy, C.S. Lewis, who is the author of my favorite childhood book, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, was a strong, committed Christian. And that, in fact, the entire series of Narnia was on one level about explaining and apologizing for the Christian faith. And then I found out that the way he became a Christian was through his dear friend, wait for it, J.R.R. Tolkien. I was blown away. I had no idea as I was devouring The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings that these were two of the most famous Christian pillars in the world. And then we started reading Mere Christianity, and I was blown away. And I never again questioned whether a smart and intelligent and intellectual person could believe in God. Well, this morning we are beginning a new sermon series called Vintage Saints and Sinners, as we take a look at the lives of some of our pillars of faith. Now, these were not perfect people. In fact, many of them had much more messy and complicated lives than most of us have. But there was something about them that was this extraordinary conviction and this very sincere, intimate relationship with God and a remarkable impact that they had on how to live out their Christian life in a broken world. My professor at Duke over the summer, Lauren Winner, writes the foreword to the book, Vintage Saints and Sinners, that we're sort of loosely doing this series after. And in it, she says, I have moved beyond seeing these people, these saints, as inaccessible super saints, and have encountered them instead as perfect companions for a real-life pilgrimage. I think most of us have grown up being told when we're going through a tough time or thinking about what we should do in a particular situation to ask ourselves, what would Jesus do, right? And yet sometimes that can feel a little intimidating, can it? That we're supposed to act like Jesus? Are you kidding me? Sometimes it's a little bit easier to take our cues from real-life people who figured out ways to act in this difficult world in real-life ways. So, C.S. Lewis, Clive Lewis Staples, was born on November 29th in 1898 to a lawyer dad and the daughter of a Church of Ireland priest in Belfast, Ireland. He started calling himself Jack after his family dog, Jaxie, who when he was 4 years old was killed in a car accident. And from that time, he not only called himself Jack, but he started writing stories and drawing illustrations with animals, and that began his fascination. When Jack was 9, his mother died of cancer. He had been very close to her. She was very warm and loving, but his father was kind of a hard and exacting man, and after his mother died, he packed him up and shipped him off to boarding school in England. A few years after he got there, the boarding school closed and the headmaster was put in a psychiatric hospital. And he ended up at another place, and then he got sick and he was in a rehab place and then back to another boarding school. But the whole time, he was very intellectually curious. Somewhere in his teens, he decided that God didn't exist, and he became an atheist, although later he would say that his atheism was more about his anger at God for having abandoned him, letting his mother die, letting his dog die, for his sense of rejection and loneliness. He got into Oxford, and after his first year, he signed up for the British Army in World War I, and he was shipped off to the front lines of France, and on his 19th birthday found himself his very first day in the trenches of the French front. Within a year, some of his best friends were killed, and he was injured, and he was sent back to England to recoup and rehab. And when that was over, he went back to Oxford and ended up graduating with top grades. And they asked him to stay on as a professor, and he became a professor of first philosophy and then English literature at both Oxford and Cambridge colleges. But also during that time, he met some of the most intellectual people in the world, including a man who would become one of his best friends, an author by the name of J.R.R. Tolkien, who was also an English literature professor at Oxford. And the two of them used to have these long conversations late into the night. And in one very famous conversation that took place on a trail at Oxford known as Addison's Walk, Tolkien challenged C.S. Lewis why he hadn't yet come back to his faith. And that night he went back to his small room and he gave himself to Jesus Christ. And he wrote this later. He said, "You must picture me alone in my room at Oxford, night after night, feeling whenever my mind lifted, even for just 1 second from my work, the steady, unrelenting approach of him who I so earnestly desired not to meet. That which I greatly feared had at last come upon me. And in the Trinity term of 1929, I gave in and admitted that God was God. And I knelt and prayed. Perhaps that night the most dejected and reluctant convert in all of England." But of course, he went on to become one of the most convinced and convincing converts of all time. Known as the apostle to the skeptics, Lewis has helped so many intellects and intellectuals to get their faith across the line. During World War II, he did a series of radio broadcasts for BBC during the war that enthralled the entire country of England and became the basis for that book, Mere Christianity. This one, that had so highly affected me when I was a young adult. Thanks to Lewis, I have come to understand through the years that faith can be a very intelligent choice that even smart and intellectual people can make. And because of Lewis, I think I started to understand that even being intellectually honest, we have to realize that faith it's a choice. That both belief and unbelief take a certain kind of leap of faith. The more I read and studied about science, the more I came to realize that even those who were the top in their fields in the various sciences were often the first to say that science cannot prove or disprove whether there is a God. And that in fact, many of the top scientists were deep, deep believers in God and in faith. That people like Einstein, who had been born a devout Jew but became an atheist and spent much of his life assuming that he would figure out all of the questions and the mysteries of the universe. By the time his life ended, he was back to being a devout Jew because he felt like we will never completely understand and there is room for God. Stephen Hawking, if you remember, he constantly went back and forth saying, oh no, I'll be able to prove a universe without God. And then he would say, no, actually I can. I think maybe there is a God. And then he'd go back and say, oh, well, maybe there isn't. People like Sir Isaac Newton was known at the time even more for the Christian commentaries he had written than his discovering of the laws of gravity. Blaise Pascal and his famous wager, even Charles Darwin himself was the equivalent of an elder in his church and remained a committed Christian even though the church kicked him out for his evolutionary theories. And what I started to understand is that atheists and believers and agnostics, we all have the exact same inconclusive, contradictory evidence to work with, but each one of us needs to make a choice as to which kind of life that we're going to live. Because it matters what you end up believing. It matters immensely. It matters which worldview you choose because it makes a tremendous difference in the way that you live and hope, in the way that you understand who you are and why you are here and your purpose and reason for existing and how to live in this world and how to treat others. Even the famous atheistic philosopher Robert Nozick concedes that practically speaking, it's probably the best to live your life as if God does exist. He says, imagine whatever it is that brings the most meaning and joyful, connected, moral life you can, and then live as if that is true. I know that for the ancient Israelites, they couldn't prove whether God existed or not, but what they did know is every time that they wandered from God, every time that they made a golden calf or started to follow other philosophies and other ideas, everything went terribly wrong for them. And that life was so much richer and so much sweeter and so much better when they believed. I know even for myself, I sometimes take great comfort in thinking, okay, even if all of this is a sham, even if I am trying to convince you to believe in a God that doesn't exist, and the moment we die, it's all just blackness and there's nothing more beyond this, I will never for 1 second regret having lived my life like this. Because we all basically are given a ballot, one ballot, to cast our vote for whether we want to live in a world that includes God or not. This is not just about estimating probabilities or about the pragmatics of living like a Christian. I believe in this with all of my heart. But part of that is because it makes all the difference in how we live our life right here and right now. And when I realize that there are good reasons to believe and good reasons not to believe, and it all comes down to a choice in what kind of life we want to live, And suddenly my question of whether smart people can believe becomes a whole lot easier to answer. Thank you, Jack. A couple of years ago, our family was on sabbatical, and we were over in London for a day, and we were walking around trying to see as much as we could, and we went to the Tower of London, and then we went to the London Bridge, or the Tower Bridge, and we were walking down along the Thames towards the Parliament Building and Big Ben, and we were hoping to make it to Westminster Abbey in time for their Vesper service. And we got there, and it was starting to drizzle, and it was kind of dark, and the sun was going down, and the service had just started when we walked through, and it was down, all the way down and over to the side in one of the wings in the Poets' Corner, and there was a bunch of folded chairs like this, and the boys' choir was singing, and it was echoing beautifully throughout that giant cathedral. And we very quietly made our way kind of towards the back, and there was 4 seats left, and so I ushered my family in, and I sat down on the very edge. And as I was starting to worship in that magnificent space, I all of a sudden realized that my chair was kind of like rocking and creaking, and I couldn't get it quite straight. And so I looked down and I realized that we were sitting on top of the tombs of all of these poets who had been interned there. And the front leg was kind of in the groove of one of the letters of this tomb that I was sitting on top of. And so I kind of fiddled around and tried to get until all of a sudden it stopped. And I had this firm foundation. And I got wrapped up immediately again in the boys' choir and the Vesper service. And then, for some reason, a few minutes later, I looked down to see who it was that I was sitting on top of. And it was C.S. Lewis, along with the quote that was around his marker that said, "I believe in Christianity the way that I believe that the sun has risen. Not only because I can see it, but because by it, I can see everything else." And I thought back to the 35 years it had been since I had been reading that Screw Tape Letters by C.S. Lewis. And I thought, what a firm foundation this saint of God has given me. Thank you, Jack. Amen.